Welcome back. I hope you're all looking forward to this next discussion held in partnership with the Anton Tunega Foundation. As always, you may ask your questions on Facebook. Joining us online is Miriam Lexman, a member of the European Parliament representing Slovakia. She will moderate the conversation titled The State of Subsidiarity in the EU, 90 Years After its Naming by Pope Pius XI. Over to you, Miriam.
Thank you to everyone who is watching us. Thank you to the Wilfried Martens Center and also to the Anton Tunega Foundation for putting this panel together. I have the privilege to welcome our two distinguished guests, Robert Royal, who is the founder and president of the Faith and Reason Institute in Washington, and he's the editor-in-chief of the Catholic Theme. Robert is an author of numerous books dealing and discussing the American people, environment, theological and political questions, and his last title is called The God That Did Not Fail. Roger Kiska is a solicitor of England and Wales and a member of the Michigan State Bar. He is a legal counsel for Christian Legal Center in London, and he also acted in numerous cases before the European Court of Human Rights and the Court of Justice of the European Union. So we have two distinguished panelists and people who can really bring the subsidiarity principle or discuss the subsidiarity principle from many different angles. I think, and I thank to the Anton Tunega Foundation for bringing up this issue, because I believe that now when after Brexit, after the pandemics, which we believe that it's coming to its end, the European Union is facing many different challenges. And we are just launching the the future of Europe debate. And I believe that to discuss the subsidiarity principle is one of the main issues we need to because we need to discuss the foundations, the basic values and foundations which brought the European Union together, and see, I mean, in this case, the principle of subsidiarity, if we observe it or where we fail to observe it, then what consequences this is bringing. And I think this is one of the important issues we should bring within the future of Europe debate into our discussions. As it was already mentioned, we are observing two big days this year on 15th of May. It will be 130 years from the encyclical written by Leo XIII, Rerum Novarum, or Rights and Duties of Capital and Labor. And this encyclical has discussed the relationship between labor and the capital, and the government and the citizens, and already described in a way the principle, the subsidiarity principle, but did not name it. It was named 40 years ago, 40 years after, by Pius XI, who issued an encyclical Quadrigessimo anno, which practically means 40 years after the first encyclical of Leo XIII. And this encyclical is discussing the dangers of human rights and human dignity coming from unrestrained capitalism, socialism, or communism. So practically, Pius XI is bringing the social issues, but also the issues of the totalitarian regimes into the context how to deal with it. And the answer of the Catholic Church is practically, or one of the answers is in the principle of subsidiarity as well as solidarity. And in this context, I would like to mention the last encyclical from Pius XI, which was also kind of discussing the dangers of a totalitarian regime, and it was the dangers coming from the Nazi regime and the incompatibility of the Nazi regime with human dignity and freedom. And this encyclical was called Mit brennenden Sorge, which was the only encyclical written in German and not in Latin. But coming back to the subsidiarity principle, I would like to open the discussion and asking Robert and Roger to come in with their thoughts about why this principle was defined in the context as it was defined, when practically in the beginning of the last century, many of the social issues were on the table, and the church was trying to seek an answer which did not bring or restrain human dignity and human freedom as different other regimes and ideologies did. So what is the kind of core issue of the principle of subsidiarity? And I'll give the floor first to Robert. Robert, where do you think that the kind of the principle lies, and how come it's still alive 130 or 90 years after and still relevant?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I praise you for putting together this conference. It's a very important issue, not only for Europe, but for the United States as well, where there tend to be more centralizing tendencies in these days. And of course, as we know, because of the internet and development communications, lots of us worry about overly centralized power in our states. And I say again, that's as much a problem in America probably as it is in Europe. But look, rerum novarum, the very name rerum novarum means of new things, literally, or more idiomatically in Latin, of revolution. And when Leo XIII wrote that encyclical in 1891, there had been several revolutions earlier that had taken place in the world. There was the Industrial Revolution. Large numbers of people were leaving, working on the land as agricultural laborers, and were moving to cities. So there was also a revolution in just where people live. They were living in cities where previously 90% of the population had lived on farms. So you get this new situation of capitalists and workers, which you mentioned earlier, that Leo has to deal with. And he's rather optimistic that if both sides recognize the interest that they have and they recognize the humanity of one another, that it's going to be possible to resolve the apparent conflict that the socialists and Marxists were trying to exaggerate, the class conflicts, because they had mutual interests. The workers had an interest in seeing that capitalist enterprises would succeed, and capitalist enterprises, if they were properly grounded in moral principles, would know that their workers had to do well in order for the companies to do well. Now, that was the foundation of where things were. By the time you get 40 years later to Quadrigessimo anno, which is, there's a whole series in the Catholic Church of these encyclicals going right up to Centesimus Annus with John Paul II after the fall of the Soviet Union. That was 100 years. But in 1931, we'd already had another revolution. There was the Soviet Revolution and the installation of Marxism or communism in a very large European state. And on the horizon in the 1930s, of course, was Nazism. So Pius XI is recognizing the dangers that exist of centralizing power, even though people are trying to do something good, justice, solidarity, bringing back the people in Germany after some horrible times in the 20s and 30s. There are dangers that are involved in the use of state power. And he wanted to make clear in a European context that individuals, the Christian understanding of the human person, and the Christian understanding of institutions, civil society institutions, were important to liberty and the proper functioning of the state. Here in America, we have a kind of a rough parallel in our federalist system, that our founders were very worried about the concentration of power as well. And so we have what we call enumerated powers that have been conceded to the federal government, and that all other issues are carried out by the individual states, and they vary in a variety of ways. So this problem of the over-centralization of power and the potential tyranny, including what Tocqueville called soft despotism, which is sort of what we see both in the United States and Europe right now, at least the threat of that, I believe. This is something that is quite fundamental for a proper understanding of individuals, persons, civil society institutions, as well as national and international bodies.
Thank you, Robert. And Roger, I will bring it a bit further the discussion, because Robert came up and explained a little bit the U.S. History, how the subsidiarity principle is related to the U.S. federal system. when we talk about the EU, we can say that the EU after the World War II was practically created as a voluntary second level of state, where the states should, which should provide a cooperation, mainly economic cooperation, for the different countries or states which fought different wars against each other. So my question is that if we kind of understand the EU as a voluntary level of statehood or arrangement of public affairs, where the subsidiarity principle, why it is important? Why do you believe that the founding fathers brought the principle into the foundations of the EU?
It's a very good question, and I guess to answer that, I would rewind a little bit to Rerum Novarum as well, and the idea that the state should be limited, that it shouldn't be despotic in regards to taxation, it shouldn't be despotic in regards to undue interference with family and the individual. And so when you get to World War II, you have an immense amount of authority being ceded in the state, whether that be in Nazi Germany or in the USSR. And so the recognition after World War II was we need to wrestle away authority from these tyrannical governments and safeguard the individual again. And that was the genesis of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, later the European Convention on Human Rights. And it was really the founding notion behind the European coal and steel community, which was the forerunner of the European Union. Later on, as that developed, when you had the treaty of the functioning of the European Union and kind of the separation of competencies, that became much more akin to what you see in the U.S. Certain authorities, competencies were given exclusively to the EU, others were given to the member states themselves. And really, if you look at it, the more intimate moral matters, the things that identify what a member state is culturally, those include religion, the definition of family, things like that, have always been vested in the member states. And it's only recently that we've seen a massive encroachment from the institutions, including the Court of Justice, in that regard.
Thank you. Thank you. Maybe one question, and maybe we can continue in this discussion related to the EU, because as a member of the European Parliament, there are a lot of, I would say, resolutions and positions of the European Parliament where I believe that we are also stepping over the subsidiarity principle, that we are breaching it in terms of calling member states to redefine the way how marriage is defined, or criticizing member states how they legally protect or not unborn life. And I consider this, when I engage in the discussions with my colleagues, when I'm trying to explain that I believe that we should not go into these areas because it breaches the subsidiarity principle, their answer is that yes, but as members of the parliament, we have the right to discuss anything and we can express any opinions. And we cannot do it in terms of law. We cannot do it in legal positions, but we can do it in terms of opinions or positions of the parliament. But how I understand this issue is that because, as we mentioned before, that the EU is a kind of voluntary level of public affairs discussion. I believe that the European Parliament should not even discuss and touch the issues which are not directly in the competence of the EU, because this is a very sensitive issue for the member states. Although I completely agree that on a level of a member state, the parliaments probably should have the right to discuss all issues, because obviously, if they don't legislate on it or not, but the kind of discussion probably should be more free, because there is a big difference between a state and the EU, which is practically a platform for cooperation. So maybe, Roger, because you are a lawyer, how do you see this issue of the European Parliament discussing, even in a not legislative terms, discussing issues which are clearly defined as a competence of the member state?
Yeah, I think discussing in a vacuum is one thing. That's not what's happening here. These are referred to as soft law resolutions, so they're not binding in any capacity, but they are quoted in judicial decisions. They're quoted by the Court of Justice, and they're quoted by the European Court of Human Rights as examples of institutional thinking and will. And so often those soft law resolutions eventually become hard law. They become policies that the Commission adopts in regard to redefinition of the family. They become judgments like the Coman judgment, where you really undermine the principle of national sovereignty on family law by suggesting that this is a freedom of movement issue. And often it's disingenuous. So if you look at the Coleman decision and the more recent advisory opinion of the Advocate General in the VMA case, where they're saying that the term spouse in the 2004 Directive on Freedom of Movement is gender neutral, I would say, look, in 2004, only 2 EU member states had same-sex marriage. So the idea that the drafters of that directive meant it to be gender neutral is disingenuous. Essentially my issue with this is that when you start discussing this at an institutional level, it drives policy. And more than that, it's used by the courts in defining what ultimately become rights. And so it's very serious.
We'll come to the different cases in the court later, but I don't want to discriminate against Robert. So Robert, if you could maybe bring in maybe examples from the US, if there is any parallel, or if you want to comment on the kind of voluntary level of the EU and the subsidiarity principle.
Well, I mean, because we share a large number of things in European and American cultures, obviously the same sort of thing has been happening here. I think that the difference in the United States is that there is a more traditional sense of liberties that are sacred, that are not to be conceded to our federal government, that there still is a large degree of a sense of the federal government can be tyrannical as much as it can be helpful to us. Now, what's happened to us in the United States, I'm not a lawyer, and maybe I should allow Roger to talk about this, but what's happened to us in the United States is we've largely ignored our own Constitution, which is a written Constitution, and it deliberately is set there. It's set up to establish limits for what our federal government does. And one of the things I like to point to that's relatively neutral, obviously life issues, trans, homosexual unions, all these things that are quite controversial in our societies are much harder to deal with right now. But take a simple example, that if you come to Washington, D.C., and you walk around, you will see that there is a Department of Education, a federal Department of Education, which has a budget of about $250 billion a year. Now, there's nothing in our Constitution that allows the federal government to have jurisdiction over education in the United States. I mean, the government could subsidize research or whatever it wants, but it is not there to establish education policy for all 50 states of the United States. And the Constitution deliberately allows the states to have jurisdiction over things like that. Now, what you're seeing in the United States right now as a result is that the way that Roger was just describing, that there's a kind of a disingenuous imposition of things that are labeled as neutral or just for discussion, that in fact are imposing very different social values in the society. There's a pushback in the individual states in the United States about questions of transsexuals, of at least establishing some limits on abortion, of trying to affirm the importance of families and communities and liberties at that level, at that level of civil society, rather than everything being run by states or by the federal government. So there's a sense right now, at least in I think, growing in the country, and some of the populism that people talk about is a kind of a confused reaction, I think, to the way that people perceive that a Washington elite are trying to establish policies on very sensitive issues for people in very different cultural circumstances in the South, in the Far West, in the Midwest, et cetera. These are legitimate cultural questions that I think are going to have to be more and more recognized, not only by our legislatures, but by our courts.
Thank you, Robert. I mean, you're practically talking about the kind of soft pressure, both of you, which is, after all, having legislative consequences. And this is a very important issue. And maybe, Roger, if you could bring, because you were defending before the EU Court of Justice, practically the campaign, one of us, which started as a citizenship initiative, which was brought by the Lisbon Treaty as an initiative coming from the citizens when they would like EU to act on a certain issue. This campaign has collected the signatures, was trying to make sure that taxpayers' money coming from the EU member states, people who are do not believe that the state has a right to finish a life before the child is born, and definitely this competence doesn't belong to the hands of the EU. But still, the EU is practically using taxpayers' money of the EU citizens for performing or supporting abortion in the third countries. So if you can maybe on this example, of this campaign, explain us a little bit the principle in practice, how practically the citizens have failed to defend the principle in the court.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I was co-counsel before the Grand Chamber of the Court of Justice defending the citizenship initiative, saying that that the Commission had acted with unfettered discretion in denying the petition moving forward from discussion by the European Parliament. Now, you have to remember that not too long ago, the EU tried to enact a constitution which failed by referendum in several member states. And really what was, I think, out of necessity and desperation for fear of the future European project, they came up with the Treaty of Lisbon. And one of the discussions there was the perceived democratic deficit by EU citizens. And so they created a mechanism whereby, under various conditions, 1 million citizens could propose legislation, which would then be heard by the Parliament and go through the legislative process. Now, one of us, as you mentioned, had those goals, which were not EU competencies, but came within the EU purview of what they can legislate, and nearly 2 million citizens signed that petition. Now that, to date, is still the most successful ECI in the history of ECIs. Yet despite that, when it went to the Commission wouldn't even hear it. They gave several really weak arguments as to why they wouldn't hear it, basically saying, we've already discussed this and there's no need to discuss it again. I mean, really the whole purpose of ceding, an initiative of authority to the citizen was to reevaluate legislation that the citizenry didn't like. So ultimately, one of the questions that shocked me during the oral arguments was one of the judges asked, well, said, is 2 million citizens in an EU of many, many million citizens doesn't amount to a lot, does it? And I thought, well, that's a lot more citizens that go into electing a whole lot of EU officials, including members of Parliament. If you can't accept the voice of the most supported ECI in history, then it's dead letter. And ultimately, we lost that case, saying that the Commission had every right to do what it did because it was the Commission. And that is ultimately, for me, the very definition of the failure of the principle of subsidiarity. We specifically enumerated it as one of our legal arguments, and it was rejected by the Court of Justice.
Thank you. Maybe I'm just thinking now, maybe let's move for a while from the kind of issues related to family and protection of life and talk about another issue, which is taxation. Because according, and Robert, you have mentioned that already at the very beginning, that practically the price we pay to the state is very, very dear to the American citizens, and they control it very vividly. And we know that now within the discussion about the own resources of the European Union, which obviously are needed because of the loans we are taking for the different programs now covering up the after the pandemic's consequences, and which is a legitimate debate that the EU needs own resources to cover some of the costs and the growing costs of the project to hold it together. On the other hand, one of the resources for the EU funding should be the common tax base, which we know that practically this is the first step to unification of taxes. And what I think is very important is to see that in Europe, not many people are reacting to this, because people in Europe usually do not know what is the price of the state, unlike the people in the US. I mean, it's only the difference that in the US you see on the price level, you know exactly, either it's written there or you know it when you pay, because practically the price is always labeled without the tax, so you know how much more you pay when you go to the cash. And I think that the thing that people are aware how much they are giving to their state, or in this case, how much would they pay to the European Union, is something which obviously brings more scrutiny and greater control of the whole project, of the way how the public affairs are managed by the citizens. And maybe the question is that, do you think, and maybe Robert, you can bring it from the US example, and Roger, if you could maybe elaborate a little bit on, as you live in Slovakia, in the European Union, in the center, heart of the European Union, what do you think that this step, which is now not very much kind of being discussed, can bring, and if you believe that this could also alert the citizens later on, when they will realize that practically the European Union is even expanding its competencies in the area of taxes, where it was never given by the citizens and the states practically. So I don't know, maybe let's give the floor to Robert now, so I can equally distribute the time.
Well, this whole question of taxation is a difficult one, obviously, because government is a very blunt instrument. I like to always remind people of that people somehow think that you debate national budgets and somehow it's going to have this precise, almost surgical effect in different areas. And it's just simply not like that. I mean, as we've seen with these COVID relief efforts, all sorts of, when you get these big bills, all sorts of other things are jammed into them, and it's regrettable. But this is unfortunately where our democracies are at this point. But that said, let's be clear about what subsidiarity means. When Pius XI put that forward, he wasn't denying that there are some things that need to be done at large levels, at large federal levels, at international levels, et cetera. But that we don't take away from the lower levels what they are able to do. In the case of COVID, I think that we need to have some national and even international programs established, but we need to debate those, and we need to make clear what monies are being spent, because, as many people often say, budgets are moral documents. They show us where a society is willing to put its material wealth in order to achieve various purposes. And so those things really need to be debated. I think that in my own country, there's not sufficient debate at the national level, the federal level, about how monies are being spent. And there's very little control because our two parties now have become very ideological. They're ideological about the sexual issues that we talked about. They're ideological about race. They're ideological about even the relationship of the federal government to the people. But we need to recover that, because there needs to be an articulation. And you're quite right, Miriam, that at least here in the United States, we're fairly transparent about what taxes exist. We will know when the Biden administration changes the overall tax rate, we will know very clearly what that is. That'll be reported on. We know what state tax levels are. We know what sales tax levels are. And that is pretty much recorded. We joke about this sometimes in the United States, but we know that the taxes are such that it's only around April or May in any given year that Americans actually stop working to pay the government and start working for themselves. That's one way to capture it, I suppose. But we need a debate on this. These are not simply moral questions. These are not simply abstract questions of what the societies are. There are always limited resources in a particular nation, in a state, in a locale, and at the national and international level. And so there needs to be some very vigorous debate about where those limited resources are going to be used. And subsidiarity and solidarity are the two principles that we call upon. I think we tend to neglect subsidiarity and recognize how lower levels ought to be more vigorously involved. And maybe that is going to come to the fore as we start to see how much is actually now being claimed by larger abstract political entities.
Thank you. Roger, do you want to come in about tax? Or maybe...
Sure. I'm not an economist, but I'll say that Leo spoke wonderfully to several concepts. One being that the state shouldn't subsume the individual or the family, and that the imposition of taxes shouldn't take away from the hard work, that is reap the benefits that owners of businesses have. And I think that principle is clear. It is true today as it was back then. And, I work in the United Kingdom, and one of our great leaders was Margaret Thatcher, who really said that there's no such thing as public funds. That is the money of those who go out and work day in and day out. And so when that money is being spent on social programs that, the average citizen wouldn't agree with, when money in Slovakia, for example, from our taxpayers is spent on research that's illegal here, we ask questions like, why would that be okay? Or when, businesses are struggling due to a pandemic and money is flowing from the EU to fund reproductive health, abortion and condom distribution in the third world. And I think the taxpayer has a right to know what their money is being used for. And there should be a very high level of strict scrutiny as to where that money is going, because at the end, it's hardworking citizens who are sending their money to the EU for it to be spent.
Thank you, Roger. And now, it's nearly time to give the floor to the questions, and I'm getting messages that we are having some questions. But I will maybe elaborate for a second on what Robert has said, that what is very clear with the subsidiarity principle is that the superior power should take only those competencies which the kind of lower power is unable to succeed in. And I'm now kind of thinking about the whole pandemics, when we were discussing again and again and again that health still belongs to the competence of the member states, that the EU has very limited competencies. And then practically, I had the feeling that no one was understanding what this actually means, that the principle of subsidiarity doesn't mean that EU can never take any competence in relation to health, because obviously dealing with the pandemics is precisely the level where the EU maybe can have some competencies when we deal with something which is kind of related to all the member states at the same time, practically the whole world. And I think this is exactly what we need to be more precise about, is that not only we name area which belongs where, but we need to know to what extent certain area belongs or can be or should stay as a competence of the member states, and where the EU can bring an added value. But that should be very clearly defined. It should be agreed upon, and only then, obviously, EU can bring up a new competence or practically. But I believe that it's already there, but we need to just read the rules more clearly. But I'll give the floor to Theo now, because he is going to bring up the first question, if I understood right.
Thank you, Miriam. Indeed, we have a couple of questions from Facebook. The first one comes from Roland Freudenstein, who is the policy director at the Martin Center. And he asks, why is it that some sovereignists, such as Viktor Orban, but also Poland's Kaczynski, always invoke the principle of subsidiarity when it comes to the relationship between the EU and the member states, but then advocate strict centralism when it comes to local and regional authorities in their own countries, thereby further cutting down on the meager rights municipalities have in their countries? Shouldn't the EPP call out this contradiction or point out this contradiction? And the second question is, should the European Committee of the Regions and the European Economic and Social Committee have a more powerful role in the decision-making process of the EU?
And these questions should be answered by both speakers, or how?
Yes, they've been asked to both speakers, so yeah, feel free.
Well, let me be a bold American and say I love Europe. I go to Europe a lot, and I've studied in Europe, and I'm going to be cautious about what I say about this because I think it's very difficult to understand other countries. But I see the same thing happening, frankly, in the way people think they understand the United States. That is, the United States is a vast continent that's quite varied, and I don't have a great deal of difficulty if individual member states of the EU take a different stance in terms of subsidiarity, what things they think are left to their competency. But these things have to be debated in democratic fashion, in an open democratic fashion. We have the same thing going on, as I mentioned earlier. We have states now that are restricting abortion. They're trying to put some limits on the way that transsexual processes for children are being carried out. These are very intimate questions. And I like the fact that states, in our case, individual states like New York or Virginia, where I live, may push back against the federal government. And I think that the individual states in the EU have a right to do the same thing. But we want to think these things through. And we also, by the way, want to allow the people within those individual states to have some say in their own states. So if the Hungarians, for example, think that Viktor Orban is centralizing the government too much, it's primarily their responsibility, it seems to me. I don't know if the EPP is a place to speak about that. I'm a foreigner, so I'm not going to pronounce on that. But it seems to me the primary responsibility in a state that respects subsidiarity is to allow citizens in their own countries to make those major decisions. I mean, unless, of course, we're looking at military tyrannies that are going to be threats to other people. But let 100 flowers bloom. We have to really allow a great deal of variation. Europe is it's a varied area as well. The French are more used, obviously, to more centralized operations. The Italians, I've spent a lot of time in Italy, they just know that their central government is not going to be of much help to them, and so they're more local in the way they respond to things. Those cultural and historical differences need to be respected, and I think the way you do that is, as I say, you allow the people within those countries to determine by their elections, by their debates that they have openly, what their particular countries are going to adopt in terms of their stances toward the larger international institutions. It's not a neat process. It's probably not always a logically consistent process, but it's what human freedom has to allow for.
Yeah, I would just add to that the TFEU, there's three levels of competency: those which are shared, those which are exclusive to the member states, and those which belong to the EU. Now, inevitably, there's areas where the EU, just by virtue of being the community in general, is better at fostering discussion among the member states on issues. And that being said, I think one of the reasons Poland and Hungary are continually saying that the principle of subsidiarity must be respected is precisely because the EU institutions are, sometimes fairly, but often unfairly targeting Poland and Hungary and encroaching on their sovereignty. So, when you ask the question of should they be calling them out more, I think it's, that's pot calling the kettle black. And I think Robert is absolutely correct that, the country itself, through its democratic process, can replace the government. It can through its own civil society, fight back against what they see as authoritarianism or the breach of principle of subsidiarity at a national level. I don't think that, and both the encyclicals we've been talking about today speak to governments, going against civil society in an appropriate way. That they should be allowed, if their motives are legitimate and serve a public benefit, to be able to do their work safely at the national level.
Thank you. I'm just reading from the studio. We don't have any further questions, but we didn't really touch upon the question if the European Committee of Regions and the European Economic and Social Committee should have more powers in decision-making processes. I mean, I'm not sure I understand this question, because obviously the powers are completely defined. So I'm not sure if we can discuss if they should have the more powers, but I guess that, I don't know if you feel like coming on these issues, or we need more explanation of what is meant by the author of the question.
I mean, I could just give my 2 cents that, shall I continue?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, one of the great documents, not from the European Union, but from the Council of Europe, is the European Social Charter, which really, if you look at it, I mean, it has its genesis from one of the international covenants of the United Nations, but as Pius rightly notes, that a lot of these social rights came from Rerum Novarum. So it's a great document. They have a committee that has competency in answering complaints when there's been violations of the social charter. So I think there's mechanisms both at the EU level and at the Council of Europe level to tackle these issues. I never think that the bureaucracy is an answer to anything. So the increasing of powers at a bureaucratic level, to me, isn't really going to benefit subsidiarity as much as take away from it.
Thank you. I'm not going to push Robert to answer this very particular question of the structure of the European Union. But anyway, our time is coming to an end. And if there are not any more questions, I will probably give to both of you still floor to maybe bring in some last final thoughts, or wrap up your thoughts, or something which you believe that the viewers can bring home, as we say, but most of them are probably at home, so bring with them into the future thinking and further thinking. Robert, do you want to come up with some final thoughts and wrap up?
Yeah, I think we need to reattach to some of the historical analysis that went on, that brought us this wonderful gift of these two balanced principles, subsidiarity and solidarity. And I'll just make one suggestion. There are many texts that people can read about this, but I find the debate that Jacques Maritain engaged in his book Man and the State to continue to be quite illuminating. It's a series of lectures he gave here in the United States at the University of Chicago. And he shows in his analysis of the human person, from that deep Aristotelian and Thomistic tradition that he followed, he showed how the human person, as it understood in both the United States and in Europe at the time, has both individual and communal dimensions. And the ways that communism, which believed in collective goods, and Nazism, which believed in a kind of a folk, the Volk as the savior, those were distortions of the proper understanding of the status of the human person, of families, of communities, etc. So I think if you go back, and of course Maritain was one of the people who inspired Christian democracy and the UN and the EU, and was just a historical figure that was extremely important. I think when you go back and when you look at the roots of the debate there, they may enlighten us a little bit from our own tradition, but from a different point in our own tradition. It may recall to us some things that we have lost, and may then help us to re-energize our understanding of subsidiarity and solidarity.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert. And Roger, you want to
Yeah, I
comment?
would just say that history is circular, and in the 1890s, you had the Industrial Revolution. In the 1930s, you had the onset of the Great Depression. Now, we don't have those, but we have a pandemic. And we also have a very nefarious form of Marxism, social Marxism, that's encroaching on the public debate. It's evident in intersectionality, in the cancel culture, and part of the reason for that is naked capitalism. So these issues that happened 130 years ago and 90 years ago are still relevant today. And I would say anyone who's watching this, I really recommend going back and reading those encyclicals. They have a lot to offer to today's situation.
Thank you, Roger. And I will maybe extend this parallel by quoting Churchill, who said that the nation which doesn't know its past doesn't have a future. And we can also make this parallel to the EU. But I believe that we need to learn from the past and learn from and be inspired by these encyclicals, not because of only the subsidiarity principle, but also because they're giving us answers how to respond to different challenges, social challenges, political challenges, with such a manner that the human dignity and human freedom is not being curbed. And I think this is practically what the principle, the main core, the core issue or idea of the principle practically is. So I hope that this discussion was inspiring for our viewers. Thank you very much, Roger, and thank you very much, Robert, to all your inspiring inputs. I would like to finally thank also to Wilfried Martens Center and the Anton Tunega Foundation, and I'm giving the floor back to Theo, to the studio. So thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you, Miriam, and thank you to our panelists for yet another lively discussion. This concludes the debates for today, but Net at Work is far from over. We'll be doing this all over again from 10:15 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. tomorrow, discussing Europe's southern neighborhood and environmental policy. Make sure to head to our website, martencenter.eu, for the full program. Thank you for joining us. See you tomorrow.